Good evening and welcome. My name is Cassie Ozer and I am the CEO of March of the Living UK. March of the Living UK was set up 12 years ago by Scott Saunders to ensure that young people from the UK could have the highest standard of experiential Holocaust education in Poland. When we look back at the past, our Holocaust education was mainly focused on victims, the perpetrators, and the bystanders. However, as we have understood further and our education has become more nuanced, we have learnt that it is considerably more complex than that. The stories of the non-Jews who saved Jewish lives, often at the utmost cost, must be widely shared. We hold these people in the highest regard, and those families who were saved have the greatest debt. We owe it to all the righteous amongst the nations to ensure that their stories are shared and that we inspire future generations by their colossal acts of bravery and moral responsibility. This evening, we are delighted to be alongside the Ostro family, who are hosting this important ceremony to honour Jozef Wegrzynowski and Wiltold Trzeciakowski for saving Max Ostro. This year's March of the Living's theme is passing the torch of memory, and that is why it is so poignant we have 4 generations of the 3 families here to share their stories and recognise the immense courage of Jozef and Wiltold. We are pleased to welcome this evening His Excellency Ambassador Yakovlevny and Chief Rabbi of Poland, Rabbi Shudrik. Also, we have Michael Birnbaum, the world-renowned Holocaust scholar, and our 6 wonderful Holocaust survivors. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Morris Ostro, son of Max.
Hello everyone. It's really amazing to see a sea of young faces. This is really what it's about. And it was a couple of years ago when my daughter Tamara and her now fiance, then boyfriend, Julia, said they wanted to go on March on the Living, which I had never done. Partly because, and as you'll hear over the years, my father did not want to really get engaged in talking about Holocaust. It was a very painful period, as it is for many people who were survivors and would rather avoid the subject where possible. And we had to do all sorts of machinations to get him to open up and talk about it. But what I would like to do now is just give you a little bit of an understanding by introducing my daughter Elia, who will come and explain a little bit about the story of my father and how he survived and help that Wiltold Trzeciakowski, whose family are here, and the Wegrzynowskis, what they did to ensure, and if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be here, and my sister and her children, my children and grandchildren, and you begin to get a sense of what we as individuals can do to make a difference in the world. And we are seeing today, sadly, as we have many times since the Holocaust, and this isn't a question of parity or comparator between different tragedies, but there are things that are happening around the world. There is evil that constantly resurges, and when it does, it needs us as individuals to think about what we can do, because the effect isn't the little acts that you're going to hear about now, but what happens 10, 20, 50 and 100 years later. So that, Eliana.
Hello and welcome. My name is Eliana and I am granddaughter of Max Ostro. Within my name there are 2 stories. My Hebrew name, Leah, was the name of my mother's grandmother, a woman who was murdered alongside of her husband in Auschwitz. My surname, Ostro, tells the story of my father's father and his extraordinary survival. A survival that wouldn't have been possible without the people we are celebrating here today. My grandfather never told me about his past when he was alive. Maybe partly because I was young, but certainly because he didn't ever want to dwell on it. As he said, I don't live in graveyards. His story was passed on to me through my parents, and after he died, from his book. It's a story that has become a part of me, so vividly and so deeply that I cannot hear the word Holocaust and separate it from the memory of him. What struck me as I tried to navigate the speeches and the timings for this hour-long event is that we couldn't possibly convey his whole story in that amount of time, let alone the story of Jozef and Wiltold. I found myself feeling profoundly sickened. It is impossible to compress the richness of 3 whole lives into 1 hour. We couldn't even do justice to just this one gruesome chapter of each of their stories in that amount of time. But even if we could, it wouldn't be enough. If you read my grandfather's book, you might be surprised that it isn't until over halfway through that he actually mentions what happens to him in the Holocaust. Because my grandpa was so much more than that. He was a living, breathing human being. He was a man with a penchant for expensive socks and sit in shops for hours and hours until they submitted to his requests for a discount. A man who would sing loudly and very badly at many occasions. He would do absolutely anything for his family, and he was full of contagious joy. I know this because he was my grandfather. But beyond their role in my grandfather's survival, I don't have the privilege of really knowing the lives and stories and personalities of Jozef and Wiltold, nor of the countless others in the Holocaust. And that is what sickens me. Tonight you hear about just a fraction of 3 people's lives. 3. To know the statistic of 6 million deaths is one thing. To try to comprehend what that actually means is much harder. I personally have no mind for figures. So to put it in context, 6 million is greater than the entire population of Singapore, or Denmark, or Sweden. And each one of those people had their own stories beyond the Holocaust. They each had names and quirks and passions and possibilities. And that doesn't even factor in the survivors who had their families ripped away from them. Wives, husbands, children, parents, siblings. They were suffocated with impossible cruelty, and some may have survived, but none without scars. Today I wish I could say that the lesson was learned and that the unthinkable cruelty shown then is beyond possibility now, but sadly I fear that isn't true. Anti-Semitism has risen across Europe again, and whilst we can't control the seemingly perennial form of hatred, we can celebrate the people like Jozef and like Wiltold, who with their actions battled it. We can encourage the same bravery today in the face of any forms of prejudice, racism, or xenophobia. As my grandpa said, I don't live in graveyards. We shouldn't be reliving this pain as an act of commemoration alone, but as a call to action. Jozef and Wiltold had to risk their lives and the lives of the family in order to help my grandma. They were willing to sacrifice everything in order to do what was right. And we don't have to. We have it easy. For us, there's no real risk in opposing toxic attitudes that try to make any one group the other. There is no risk in helping when people are in crisis. Today, there's no excuse for us not to speak and act up. The Holocaust didn't come out of the blue, and it didn't begin with the gassing of the Jews. It began with words. Being indifferent is dangerous. That is why the work of people and organizations such as March of the Living are so crucial. This is why sharing these stories are so important. We need the world to do more. Remember what happened. We need them to truly fathom what each one of the 6 million actually means. We need them to see the danger of not acting. The theme of this year's March of the Living is passing the torch, something fundamental to every single member of my family. My sister Tamara will be speaking next. Her Hebrew name, Rachel, like mine, carries the story of a lost family. Rachel was my grandfather's sister, who, like my great-great-grandmother, died in Auschwitz, along her husband and 2 children. We carry their memories in our names and our DNA, and it is a privilege to be able to pass on their stories.
Hi. My grandfather Max was born on the 11th of July, 1925, in Szydlowitz, a small town 18 miles away from Warsaw. He lived with his parents, Shmuel and Hanna Ostrowiecki, and his 2 brothers, Hanina Aaron and Yeheskel Benjamin. His older sister, Rachel Leah, lived with her husband and 2 children in Ostrowiec. My grandfather's entire family perished in the Holocaust. My great-grandparents worked together and ran a successful iron hardware business. In September 1939, when the Nazis came to Szydlowitz, my grandfather's parents made arrangements with a Gentile friend and business associate, Wiltold Trzeciakowski, to hold what money and valuables they had on trust, should any of them survive. It was this act that would later save my grandfather's life. In 1942, the Nazis commenced the liquidation of Szydlowitz. On the 13th of January 1943, my grandfather was taken on a train to Treblinka with his parents and his brother Hanina Aaron. His other brother, Yeheskel Benjamin, was kept behind by the Nazis to bury those they shot at on the way to the trains. He was later murdered. My grandfather had contracted typhoid and was extremely weak and was barely able to make it onto the train. The alternative for not making it onto the train was simply being shot. Once in the cattle truck, there was barely room for people to stand, but my great-grandparents managed to clear a space for my grandfather, who recalls lying in a feverish state on the ground, singing the words to Elihu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. His father was almost prophetic, and I still have chills as I recall my grandfather telling us how with absolute certainty his father had promised that one of his sons would survive. In his weakened state, of course, it seemed more likely to be a healthier, stronger older brother. Despite the objections from those who feared repercussions from the Nazis, my great-grandfather managed to prise away the barbed wire on a small window, so it was large enough for his sons to escape. He told them both to jump through the window of the moving train and run in opposite directions, so that they could find each other on the track. He said that just as Jacob divided his family into 2 when his brother Esau hunted him, if one group were to be attacked, the other would survive. My grandfather described them davening the afternoon prayers on the train, recalling the whole incident as awe-inspiring. Jews were being herded to their deaths like animals, yet transcending their physical state in prayer. They were ever hopeful that God might still have mercy on them. At night, under the cover of darkness, Hanina jumped first. Normally, that would be the person more likely to survive, as the Nazi snipe shooters might not be prepared. My grandfather jumped second. Age 17, feverish with typhoid, freezing and alone, my grandfather was left to wander through the snow, calling out his brother's name. Sadly, he never found him, nor knows how he may have perished. All alone, he knocked on doors in the hope someone would let him in, but no one did. He had no choice but to bury himself in the snow for warmth and sleep. The next day, he continued knocking, trying to find help or even just get directions. Finally, one man let him in. He asked for his papers, so my grandfather handed over false identity papers that did not identify him as a Jew. Hoping his blondish hair and blue eyes might help his disguise, he went into the warmth. But immediately, the man locked him in and told him he'd be killed for masquerading as a Christian. The man's young daughter pleaded with her father to leave the boy alone, and when she was ignored, she unlocked the door and set him free. But the man, in his baseless hatred, did not desist. He pursued my grandfather in a sleigh joined by 2 other large men who he called to his aid. My grandfather did not stand a chance. They beat him senseless and then handed him to the police. My grandfather recalls that when he was handed over, the men had taken great pains to stick back together the false identity papers that my grandfather had ripped up to destroy the incriminating evidence. As the policeman handed over the reward for the Jewish teenager, which was 2 kilograms of sugar, 2 bottles of vodka, and 2 loaves of bread, he reminded them that the reward was for the capture of the Jew. They got nothing for beating one. Then came the most serendipitous moment. The policeman recognized my grandfather. He had seen his sister years before in his parents' store, which was next to my great-great-uncle and aunt's store. And knowing the family had money, he sensed there might be an opportunity for exploitation. Although no Jew was able to hold on to their fortunes themselves, my grandfather still said he could pay. The police officer demanded 10,000 zlotys to send my grandfather to a work camp instead of the camp. With unbelievable chutzpah, my grandfather decided to bargain and offered 5,000 zlotys. Of course, he had no way of knowing if he could actually get the money held by Wiltold, for many Jews had arrangements like this, but they were not upheld. The police officer wrote to Wiltold, but it was only on Shabbat, when my grandfather was released to Pionki work camp, that he knew with absolute certainty that Wiltold was there to help save him. I would now like to introduce the grandson of Wiltold Trzeciakowski, also named Wiltold Trzeciakowski.
Yes, we are all Witolds. This is a family tradition that the eldest son is named Wiltold. So my grandfather was Wiltold number 1, my father was Wiltold number 2, I'm number 3, and my son is number 4. I didn't know my grandfather since he was killed in 1944, 8 years before I was born. So I only heard stories from my father, my uncle, and from Max Ostro. My grandfather was born in around 1880 in the town of Żytomierz, which is now in Ukraine. At that time, Poland did not exist as an independent country, and he was in the Russian part. And he went to study mining in the Technical University of Riga in Latvia. After his studies, he was employed by the US company Standard Oil, which later split into several companies existing till now, like ExxonMobil or Chevron. He worked, they were exploring the region of Borisław for crude oil, and he worked there for several years, and he met my grandmother, Zofia Łazowska, and he got married at the age of 44, but his wife was 16 years younger. I tried to beat this record, and I got married at the age of 48, and my wife is 18 years younger. They moved to Warsaw in the 20s, and he decided to set up his own enterprise. He bought a small property in the south of Warsaw, close to Piaseczno, and they also had an apartment in the center. And he started a foreign trade enterprise. He traveled a lot. I found his old passport with many stamps. My uncle told me that one of these deals was with Persia, where he exported steel rails for the construction of a railroad from Abidan to Tehran, and they could not pay him with foreign currency. They paid him with carpets, raisin and furs, and we still have two beautiful Persian carpets from those days. He decided to start a production facility, and at that time there was a central industrial region organized, COP, in Poland, since Poland was very rather agricultural country. The government wanted to increase the industrial production, and my grandfather, within this big project, decided to build a factory in Szydłowiec. It was called Podkowiak. I still have a box of shares of this company, and they produced wires, nails, and especially nails for horseshoes, since the Polish army had a big cavalry division. And Szmul Ostrowiecki, Max's father, was supplying iron to the factory. And this is how they got in touch. Szydłowiec was mainly 80% Jewish city, and my grandfather would circulate between his property in Warsaw, Pulko, called Pulko. Actually, this was the place where Jozef Wegrzynowski visited him during the time when he helped Max. And my grandfather traveled from Pulko to Szydłowiec, and from what I heard from Max, he visited their house several times and engaged in philosophical discussions with Max's father. Max could not understand everything. He tried to listen to these conversations. He was very curious, but it wasn't about business. It was about philosophy, religion, politics. So it was an amazing connection between two men from different worlds. But somehow they respected each other and trusted each other. So then in the future, Max knew that he could rely on my grandfather. My grandfather wanted my father to take over the business in the future, but my father was a musician and wanted to become a concert pianist, so he didn't want to get into business. The factory was operating during the war. At some point, my grandfather was accused by the Germans of sabotage and arrested, but he managed to get released after paying a bribe. My father also mentioned that during the occupation, my grandfather had some secret meetings with people that he helped. I don't know who they were, if they were Jewish or not, but of course my grandfather wouldn't tell my father. It was best to keep such things a secret. But my father had to follow him to these meetings and make sure that he is not detained, and let know my grandmother in case something happened. So the occupation went on. My father became involved in the underground army. He was a scout, and he was in this secret army in Battalion Gustav. And on the day the uprising and war started, 1st August 1944, My grandparents went by train from Pulko to the center of Warsaw to meet my father. But on the day the uprising started, the Germans kidnapped people on the streets and shot them. And my grandparents were victims of such shooting. We haven't found their bodies. We don't know where they were buried. And mother was still hoping that they were alive, but that unfortunately was not true. He fought in the uprising. He was wounded in his left hand, so his fingers were stiff and he had to give up his musical career. And later he studied economy and took over the business as my father have wished. But it didn't take long because this whole business was confiscated, was nationalized a few years later by the communist government. I would like to get back to Max's story, but I think I'll break here and I let continue the fate of Max, and afterwards maybe I'll say a few words how we met with Max later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wiltold. And it brings us to the next juncture in the story, which is he has now been released from the police station, not to a death camp, but to a work camp in Pionki. He gets to this camp and he meets a man called Abram Landsman. And this man is a survivor with him and ends up being his very closest friends. You all have received one of the numerous books that he's written. One of them, in fact, the one that you're being presented, Anna Trzeciakowski, I should say, were actually translated into Polish years later. And what happened was when they got to the camp, so this is not a death camp, this is a work camp. And so there were normal people doing their jobs. There were engineers, carpenters who were working there. And there were slave labor, Jews. And what my father did was he saw this man, Avla Landsman, and there were other Jews there, and he was walking around almost like a ghost. Literally, he didn't have shoes on his feet. He was barely alive. But he could see he was a special person. He went up to him and he introduced himself, and they did this sort of Jewish Joffrey thing, you know, who do you know who you're from, and this and who you know, and et cetera, et cetera. And he developed a very close relationship with him. And he said, look, you've been here for a while. Who can I trust here? Because I'm here today, I'm alive, because there's a man in Warsaw called Wiltold Trzeciakowski, and he sent money, police, to release me, to bribe them, so that I could actually get here to this camp. And I know if I write to him again, he will take care of me. But I need to trust one of the people here in the factory. And Abram said, I know this man, Jozef Wegrzynowski. He's a gentleman, and you can trust. So he approaches this man, and they do an arrangement. He writes a letter, which Jozef then sends to Warsaw, saying, I'm alive, it worked, thank you for sending the money to the policeman, and I'm now here, I'm in this slave camp, please can you send money? Because of course, as you can imagine, the provisions, the food that they were given was negligible, so they needed to survive, and he sent money on a weekly basis to this man, Jozef, who would then buy food, and that's not only sustained my father, and not only Landsman, but numerous others that were in the camp. So that worked fine for a while, but when the armies started coming close to the area where they were, the Germans started to retreat. And this was an armaments factory. They were making, like Schindler's List, they were making bullets, whatever it was some sort of ammunition. So they were trying to take the equipment, and what they would do is they'd take a few of the slaves to help them and remove everything to Germany. And of course, once they had done the work, the Jews were all killed, and my father knew that was it, so he made an arrangement with Jozef and Wegrzynowski, and they start to liquidate the camp. I'm going to run away, I'm going to take whoever I can, and we're going to leave the camp. He unlocked the door, he left one of the gates open so that my father could escape, and he went to their house. And at that point, I'd like to hand over to Carolina, who's Joseph's great-granddaughter, who will explain a little bit more about how he survived there. Carolina.
Good evening. When I was a little girl, I used to spend every summer with my parents and my grandma's house in the countryside. I liked the surroundings of fields and forest, and the smell of damp wood, so characteristic for an old house. It was my grandmother's family home, where she grew up with her two brothers. During warm August evenings, my grandmother and I have been taking long walks through the fields, and Grandma was telling me stories about her childhood, the life in the countryside, of course, how she met my grandfather. However, her favorite story to tell was that of a Jewish boy hiding in a barn under the hay. Today, we hear this story from a completely different perspective. I've never met my great-grandfather or Max Ostro, so today I rediscover this story with you. The story I can share are the moments of a 7-year-old girl who quietly watched the events from the side and didn't understand what was happening. When Max arrived at the Wegrzynowski farm, Danusia, my grandmother, was 7 years old, farmer's beloved daughter. Her father, Jozef, was a respected and popular man in the village. He worked in the gunpowder factory Pronit in Pionki, half an hour from their home. There he met Max, a young Jewish boy who he became friends with. Wegrzynowski was helping him and giving money from Wiltold Trzeciakowski, a friend of Max's parents. When the forced labor camp in Pionki has closed down, Max came to the Wegrzynowski farm looking for shelter. It wasn't difficult at first. The boy stayed mainly in the high barn. Only on the colder days, he slept on the small place behind the stove at their house. For fear of people, he only came out of hiding after dark. He remained hidden. My grandmother mentioned that she hadn't seen Max very often. He had much better contact with her older brother Tadeusz, as they were of similar age. Their father told them that they were not allowed to tell anyone about their quiet guest. A 7-year-old girl knew that it's something important, that they had a great secret. Everything changed when the German army has decided to stay at the Wegrzynowski farm. Due to the position of my great-grandfather in the village, the commanders decided that they would stay at their house, and the soldiers would sleep in utility rooms, also in this high barn. When Wegrzynowski found out that the Germans wanted to stay in the village, he told Max that he had to leave their house. Wegrzynowski feared for the life of his wife and his children. For hiding Jews, their house could have been burned down and their family killed. However, Max had nowhere to go. It was a moment of decision, and they decided. hole in the ground, covered with wood and hay, invisible from the outside. Max was supposed to wait out the most dangerous moments there. He spent all days in this grave, and Wegrzynowski brought him food, water, and everything what was necessary to survive. The months were passing, and the situation was not getting any safer. Only a strong will to survive and Wegrzynowski's help kept Max alive. But his life in those days had little to do with normal human life. My grandmother had vivid memories of the day Max came out of the ground. She said he looked like a shadow of a man. He was even thinner and paler than before, had a very long tongued beard, and his hands and feet were frostbitten in places. But he was alive, and he was safe. My grandmother passed away 4 months ago. I am sad that she did not live to see this moment. She will be very happy to know that today we are meeting here to recall what happened years ago. I am so grateful that today I can share the story that until now lived only in memories of my grandmother, but as we can see, was very much real. My grandmother's memories became a torch that she passed on to her children and grandchildren. And I know when my son grows up, he will also hear this story. When I think about current world situation, I know that this torch must burn. We must remember the history, especially now, when the war is not just a grandma's story from the past. The war is real again. This meeting reminds us that in the face of human suffering, one cannot remain indifferent. One cannot look away. Today, we also need righteous among the nations. Thank you.
In 1944, my grandpa escaped from Pyeonggi. As promised, Jozef left a gate open, and under the cover of darkness, under barbed wire, and through a building that was being taken apart for scraps, my grandpa escaped. He arrived at Jozef's front door, and as with Wiltold, he had no way of knowing for sure if Jozef would keep his word and let him in. Wiltold was still providing money, but there is no denying that this act risked not only Jozef's life, but the lives of his family too. My grandpa was taken in and kept in the barn, but after an unfortunate incident, things were set to become infinitely more unbearable. Nazis stormed into the barn. A ladder had been kept at a distance from the loft where my grandfather hid, so Jozef would have time to see if they were going up to his hiding spot. My grandfather, fluent in Yiddish, understood their German perfectly and knew what was happening, but to the outside eye it seemed damning. Jozef took his family to hide in the forest, sure he was to be killed for his crime. The Nazis were in search of hay. One climbed the ladder, removed hay, then more and more. My grandfather made a silent prayer but was never able to explain what actually happened next. He was exposed and he could see the Nazi, meaning the Nazi could see him. But he was somehow not seen. After the incident, Jozef returned from the forest, from days of hiding, and told my grandfather that it wasn't safe to stay in the barn, as he was putting himself and his entire family at risk. An undeniable fact. They agreed that my grandfather would have to be buried in a pit underground, and there he hid, in a living grave, with only a hole for air, through which Jozef would pass some potatoes and a bottle of water every few days. Lying in the grave, he suffered from extreme cold, hunger, and thirst. The hole wasn't deep enough for him to stand, and he had to stoop when he sat. He kept himself sane by living in prayers and memories and dreams. He didn't leave the grave-like hiding place from the moment he entered on November 11th, 1944, until the middle of January 1945. There was another risk to Jozef, who heard my grandpa singing to himself, risking his hiding spot. But merely surviving was not the only goal for my grandfather. He needed to preserve his life. As his father predicted, prophetically, only one last ember of the Ostro-Wieckis, a once huge, well-respected and thriving family, remained. By the final August of the war, the Second Rebellion had broken out in Warsaw, and Wiltold was one of the brave leaders. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. From that moment on, Jozef no longer received any money for keeping my grandfather. From what I understand, Jozef was conflicted. It's not an easy choice. It's not just a question of wanting to help someone, because the urge to save one's family is so great. Thankfully, my grandfather was allowed to remain there until the end of the war. When my grandfather emerged from the grave, he couldn't walk. His legs were severely damaged from being cramped into a small space for months. He received medical care, rest, and then decided to return to his home, ready to rebuild. Unfortunately, that was not to be. Several survivors returned to their town, Szydlowitz, which was a shell of former glory. Strangers had moved into their homes, and my grandfather was even greeted by a destroyed tombstone when he went to see his grandparents' grave. And the final blow? He was put on a hit list for having the audacity of being a Jew that wanted to come back to his home. My grandfather left his town, and for the rest of his life he never truly settled in any one country.
My grandfather's story is an amazing tale of survival, and I take a huge amount of pride in telling it. But one story of survival does not compare with the immeasurable loss and the tragedy of the Holocaust. My grandfather did not just lose his entire family. His entire life and the world he came from was destroyed. There was no home for him to return to. A few years ago, I changed my last name from Ostro to Ostro-Wieckis, and not because it's easier to spell, but because my family lost, as did so many millions of Jewish families, so much in the Holocaust. This was my way of reconnecting what we had lost and keeping that memory alive. Because, despite the efforts of the Nazis to wipe out the Jewish people, here we are today, descendants of survivors passing down their stories. And by sharing these stories, we can hope that history never repeats itself. We owe it to all the lives lost in the Holocaust and to future generations to never forget.
So bringing us up to the present day, or to post-war, and then I'm going to introduce and ask His Excellency the Ambassador Yakov Livne to address us and to address Wiltold and his mother. Anna, maybe you'd like to, I don't want to make you stand for too long, but if you wouldn't mind to come here and join us. And I haven't seen... It was quite interesting. So I was living in Belgium for a little while with my father, and my father was one day reading the newspaper, and I was just telling the Chief Rabbi Shurich and the ambassador a few minutes ago how I was just, he was reading the paper, and he on the front page of the newspaper that day it said, Dr. Wiltold Trzeciakowski, the finance minister of Poland, says something or other. And my father looks at me across and says, this is the weirdest thing, it's not possible. It's exactly the same name, and I know the guy's dead for sure, because he went to Warsaw after he had left Szydlowitz, as my daughter was saying, and he contacted the embassy of the Polish embassy in Belgium and said, this is probably just a waste of your time, but would you mind sending I think it was telegrams, I think, or faxes they had in those days, to Warsaw, to the Ministry of Finance, and find out if there's any relation. He knew it was dead, so it just couldn't work out why it was the same name. And we got a response back very soon afterwards saying, yeah, my father was Wiltold. I'm Wiltold Trzeciakowski too. And the minister invited us to Poland. I had just got married. It was 1991. We arrived and we came to meet Anna and her husband at their home. And Wiltold and I only met some time afterwards. And that brings us, so please do come here and tell us. She was alive, obviously, during the war. Didn't meet my father until many years later, as I say, but it'd be lovely if you'd say some word to us about your memories.
Just with pleasure, because
Closer, bliżej.
but I am 94, so it's something. What I can tell you, I think that I am almost in the age of your father, if he was alive. Just a few words. Max was simply charming. It wasn't only that he was a man who survived thanks to my grandparents, whom I didn't know, because I never met them. They were already kids when I met my future husband. But just imagine, it was somewhere in the late 90s when my husband told me that we shall have a guest tomorrow. And he will come from, I don't know, Belgium. And please prepare something, welcome him. And in the 90s in Warsaw, there was practically no food, and it was really a problem to get something. So you can imagine me trying to do something to accept this guest, to welcome him. And my husband then became a minister of economy. As you know, in the 90s, there were the great turn of politics here. There was a government run by a Solidarity. My husband was a Solidarity man. So I was to prepare something to welcome somebody very important and very dear, but no food. So therefore I wanted to present you, to tell you how it looked like. I was scared who will come and how shall I greet him. We sent, my husband then, as I said, being a minister, sent his car, his official car, to the airport. And Max arrived. And the door were opened, and I saw a charming man who just opened his arm and he said, hello. So I just ran in his arms and I said, hello. And I made it all the time. I knew, of course, his history. We were like a family. Every time when he arrived, when he came to Warsaw, he was simply welcomed. I think that there was something very important. His mother's name was Anna. And it was the first thing Max told me, that his mother was Anna, so that he assumes that if I am Anna too, so maybe something good may be in this coincidence. That's practically all I can say. Of course, it's very much on the surface. I knew that Max depends on something which is called great and deep faith. And of course, my grandfather, not grandfather, but grandfather-in-law, whom I never met, did something to help. But the main thing which helped Max was his faith. And I can say, because I heard it, we talked very often. I'm a Catholic, but we certainly had the same God. And I think that that was Max's strength, enormous strength. And besides, as a woman, I can say only that he was charming.
Thank you so much. So
I can only add that my mother was the only woman that Max was afraid of. And because normally he was a male chauvinist, I must say. But he was really
but
respected.
before you go, perhaps if I may, we'd like to present something to... Oh, I'm very sorry. Ambassador, would you like to, you're going to be thanking the Trzeciakowskis, and please maybe have a photo just now, and before we ask you to sit down, and maybe just do so and then address the audience, or whichever way round you prefer. Would you mind?
We're very close on Lankiewicz.
Oh, so
We start
round the
the
corner.
street, and you're then.
So we'll...
And one better looking here, please. And the second set. Do you want it to?
Sure, I'm sure you just for one photo, and we can always do it afterwards. So I think it's I'm here with you.
Thank you. Just looking here. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, please, thank you very much. Please come and sit down.
Thank you very much. I think what we have heard today is extremely moving. I'm relatively new here in Warsaw, relatively new in this capacity of being ambassador. It's my second such event of thanking people who saved Jews, thanking people who risked, as you have heard, risked everything. Risk their lives and risk something which I think most of us cherish even more, the lives of our families, of our children. And still you had people who were ready to do this. I have to say, I find it almost unbelievable. You know, when we teach young people in Israel and Israeli schools about the Holocaust, obviously the issue of righteousness among the nations is being told. We tell this story because we find it extremely important. And then one of the questions that we pose to Israeli students in the schools is, what would you have done if you found yourself in such an impossible situation? I'm not sure any of us have really simple answers. First, ourselves. So, what we have heard is really extraordinary. What the Wegrzynowski family did is unbelievable as other stories of this kind that we know. Until now, in Yad Vashem, this is the place in Israel where such stories are researched and learned. Until now, Yad Vashem acknowledged a bit more than 20,000 righteous among the nations cases in all the world. I don't know how many people know that more than a third of these, 7,200 if I remember correctly, actually come from Poland. And one of the reasons is exactly what we have heard, that here in Poland, saving a Jew was extremely dangerous. And the fact people actually did this is something that we have to remember. And also the stories of families like, Trzeciakowski. And imagine yourself in the middle of such events. What would each and every one of us do? We don't really know. And the last point I wanted to make was actually mentioned before. This is also the motto of this year's March of the Living, giving torch to the young generation. I'm extremely happy that most of the people sitting here are young. Mr. Ostro, I think it's extremely important. When we talk in Israel about the Holocaust, then unfortunately, in many, many families, we hear stories that are too crazy to believe just the story that we heard today. So I hope very much, I'm sure that when you come back from this trip, from this visit, you will have a better understanding of our common history, because this is not a history of one family. This, unfortunately, is the history of many, many Jewish families in the past. We need to learn this history. We need to understand how it happened, in order not only to respect the victims and those who survived, but also never, ever to allow that anything like this could happen again. Thank you very much.
May I introduce Rabbi Shudrich, the Chief Rabbi of Poland.
Thank you very much. You know, I've been to many ceremonies over the last 30 years of Chasidim Mot Olam, of Liva, righteous among the nations. But for me, this evening is very special because I got to know Max Ostro when I was rabbi in Tokyo, Japan in the 1980s. And Max was traveling in his diamond business. And while I was listening to the stories from his granddaughters, and actually I got to meet Maurice and his sister Anna when we were all much younger. I don't know if you were 20 at that point. And I realized that I never heard stories about the Shoah, about the Holocaust from Max. And then, as the two were telling the stories, I remember he told me one story. And perhaps, I don't know if you ever heard this part. It's the story about being in the train to Treblinka. And that he told me he was very sick, he was lying down. He already knew that his father was preparing the window for them to jump. And they davened mincha, they said the afternoon prayers before they jumped. And his father told Max, he says, stand up for Kedusha. For this prayer, particular prayer during the repetition of the Amidah, we are supposed to stand. Max is barely alive, and he says, for Kedusha, you have to stand. That's what's going to keep you alive. And this story, when I heard you telling it, I remembered that from 35 years ago. It wasn't everything. It was also, you have to stand for the Kedusha. He survived. We are in a very challenging time in the world right now. as Carolina mentioned, what's happening now in the Ukraine is horrendous. We're more righteous. So I was reflecting about what is the lesson we can learn from righteous. We, the Jews of Europe, we, the Jews of the world. What lesson can we learn from the righteous about today? And I think what it is that 80-something years ago, when we were running for our lives, there were unbelievable human beings who were ready to risk their own lives, which we don't have to do today, ready to risk their lives for people who weren't from the same religion, weren't sometimes even known to them. And so I very deeply see the lesson is that today our Jewish obligation is to learn the lesson of the righteous. That we have an obligation to help every Ukrainian who's trying to save their lives without looking at what religion they are, or faith, or political background. Our obligation, as we learn the lesson of the righteous, is our obligation is to help every human being we can to escape from the horrors of this horrible, immoral war of Russia against the Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. And to conclude, if the ambassador would kindly present the great grandchildren of Jozef Wegrzynowski with the award for the Righteous Amongst the Nations. Please, both of you, do come up. Carolina. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you all. This is the first time that I've ever met them, and brings our proceedings to a conclusion. But please take your seats. I might ask, if I may, if you look, I mentioned at the beginning, and with this I will end, that it is all about the impact, not of the action that you do today, but what it will be tomorrow and in future years. And you'll see Eliana, who was speaking earlier, the one in blue. Tamara over there is the one who is in white. And their partners, who they were coming here on the March of the Living a couple of years ago, even before Yad Vashem made a decision to award letters of gratitude to the family of Wiltold Trzeciakowski and the awards that the ambassador just presented now. And their partners, please do come and join us, Julius and Max. And it's unbelievable because this was not prepared at all, I promise. But Rabbi should have mentioned something which I had forgotten at this point. And in Kedusha, in this prayer that my grandfather said to my father to stand up because it is the holiest prayer, when repeated by the Chazan, there's a piece at the very end, which is L'dor vador, from generation to generation. It's a prayer that is about us learning from the past in order to create the future. And our story is not unique. Max, who's Eliana's partner, is named after, as you could see, has a similar name. His mother was Anna. I mean, these are coincidences, but also coming from a part of the world where there was, not far from here, and Julius, whose great uncle, in fact, was the last person who was there at the signing of the the independence of the State of Israel, is Aryeh Handler, who was negotiating. I think it was with Eichmann, wasn't it? Who was one of the emissaries trying to save Jews. This is part of our history, and if I may, just to conclude, just sing you just a little bit of this song of Kedusha, which is Le Dor Vador. There you go. And please, to the end, do join us. Le Dor Vador, Le Dor Vador, Le Dor Vador, Nagid God Lecha, Ule Netzach Netzachim, Ule Netzach Netzachim, Kedushat HaNagdish, Le Dor Vador, Nagid God Lecha, Ula Netzach Netzachim, Ula Netzach Netzachim, Kedushat HaNagdish, V'shivcha Eloheinu, mipinu lo yamush le'olam va'ed, ki Melech Gadol, Melech Gadol, v'kadosh ata, Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, Nagid God Lecha, Ula Netzach Netzachim, Ula Netzach Netzachim, Kedushat HaNagdish. Thank you very much for joining us, for participating in this very special ceremony. It's been an incredible privilege for us to meet you for the very first time, to see you and the family after so many years, and to remember the good that you've done, for us to be here today, for all of our generations, not my father, not my sister and myself, not my children or her children, but now their grandchildren, is an expanding family on every front, and all of that has to be remembered. That is the ultimate outcome of good that we do. We never know how far it will extend. Enjoy your trip, learn from it, and pass the torch to your friends, to your communities, to the world. Thank you.